So, morning. We're in the middle of a series looking at the Sermon on the Mount, and we're looking actually how do we live this out? And I've got the light and fluffy topic of anger. We do talk about anger at times, and we have to remember that it is an emotion. It's just a response to a perceived hurt or insult. And there's a little cartoon character that comes up. This is the sort of how we see anger a little bit. But if that perceived hurt or insult is left, it can become a resentment. It can fester, and that can lead to actions or words which are hurtful. And I'm not someone who's prone to lots of anger. It's not one of my besetting sins, if you like. But I do know that when I'm driving, clearly I'm not alone, I get that sense of frustration. And if other people drove more considerately, better, then I would be able to just take that left turn because they would have squashed up to the car in front of them while sat at the lights. Ever felt that when you're a little bit late? Basically, if they were thinking like me, it wouldn't be a problem. At that point, I am focusing on them. I am blaming them. I am getting angry about them. And that easily, and for some people more easily than others, can become seething, fuming, explosive anger. And as a family, we actually know what that's like when someone starts banging on your window because they have absolutely lost it over a small thing in the car. And that is very scary, very, very scary indeed. Now, the Bible doesn't say don't get angry. It accepts this is part of our emotions. It's part of who we are. It is part of our natural response system. But when we look at Ephesians 4, Paul says, in your anger, do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger. In other hands, don't let it fester. Don't let it become something that's deep down inside that is actually harming you and others. So, Matthew 5. Jesus said he's talking to a large crowd. He's got his disciples around. He's got others that are following him. And he's then talking to this large crowd. And he says, you have heard that it was said to the people long ago, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, Raca, is answerable to the court. And anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the fire of hell. Therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar and there remember your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to them. Then come and offer your gift. Settle matters quickly with your adversary who's taking you to court. Do it while you're still together on the way, or your adversary may hand you over to the judge, and the judge may hand you over to the officer, and you may be thrown into prison. Truly I tell you, you will not get out until you've paid the last penny. Now, it was very common in this time and in this part of the world, in Jewish setting up, to use real hyperbole, to put things in the extremes. So you get a lot of nevers and, those kind of extreme ends of things. But it's there to make the point. But Jesus clearly sees this one as an important one because it actually is a much longer bit than any of the other of these you have heard it said and I say to you bits. This is important because it affects all of us. And Jesus gives kind of a couple of examples as well to help us to understand it, put it in slightly different points of view. So just before this bit, and Esther spoke a little bit on this last week, in Matthew 5, verse 17, Jesus says, "Do not think I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I've not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." And then he goes on to say about this. And he highlights the importance of the law and the prophets, so the Hebrew scriptures, what we often call the Old Testament. But Jesus has come to fill these up, to make those commands full, to bring us into a full life, living out those things that he's put into place. And the Sermon on the Mount is actually part of Jesus' way of actually doing this and explaining this to us. So he's writing these things on our hearts. And in both Jeremiah and Hebrews it says, "I will put my laws in their hearts, I will write them on their minds." This is how Jesus is doing it, it's by talking about it, by giving examples. And the thing is, we can only really hear Jesus' teachings when we understand that we are blessed in him. So all those blessings that Stuart talked about some weeks back, when we understand that, we can then go, okay, I can think that this is a life I can live. This is something I can move towards. So this morning we're looking at the first of 6 statements where Jesus points to the Hebrew Torah and then gives his take on it. Okay, so this is the teachings of the Hebrew Scriptures. The first one is about murder and anger. The next one, adultery and lust, divorce, oath-making, revenge, love your neighbour. So I've got the first one of these. So when Jesus said, "You have heard it said or taught," and then, "But I say to you," they would have known these things. These were so steeped in their culture that they would have known these things from when they were tiny. They would have all heard them. These sayings were not things that were unusual or things that were a surprise. But and Jesus doesn't contradict it. He doesn't say, actually, it says there, "Do not murder," but actually I'm going to say something completely different and that bit's okay. That's not what he's saying when he says, "But I say to you." So the Torah says, "Do not murder." Murder is about the actions. Jesus says, "Do not be angry," or about anger. And anger is about the heart, about the mind. He's pointing out the link between these things. You don't get murder without the anger. So Jesus comes in at a much lower level and says, look, this is what's behind it. Let's start here. But the thing is, when Jesus gives those examples, they're very relational. It's about relationships. Be reconciled. That's a relational thing. You can't be reconciled to someone if there's no relationship there at all. And he talks about us sorting things out personally, if that's possible. So when we then go further through the New Testament, we see that James emphasises the underlying heart and mind even more than we see it here. And there are some people who say that the book of James is almost a sort of commentary on the Sermon on the Mount. It's taking the teachings of the Sermon on the Mount and actually making them a bit more clear to us. And I wonder, is that because by the time James was writing, and James is Jesus' little brother, is it because people were even trying to take what Jesus was saying and turn that into a list of rules and regulations? And James points out even more clearly, no, it's about the heart. It's about what's going on in your heart, your mind. That's the important thing. So in James 1, he says, "My dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. because human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires. So when we see that, we see that Jesus is not trying to get our behaviour to change. He's not saying, change your behaviour, because we all know how that works out. What he's saying is, let's work on our hearts and minds. Let's change what's going on underneath. Because when we change what's going on underneath, when we deal with our anger, we don't murder. When we change what's going on underneath, when we deal with our anger, we treat people as real people, not as them. And I think that's true. It's not just anger. It's so many of our actions come from what's going on underneath. If we deal with what's going on underneath, then our actions will follow. And I think that's true of most of the things that we see in this section of the Sermon on the Mount particularly, where Jesus says, okay, look, yes, I know these are the actions that we're talking about, but this is what's often underneath it. Let's deal with this. So again, when James is talking about it, he says, not don't ever become angry, but don't use human anger. Don't be quick to hear. Be slow to speak. Be slow to anger. Again, they're relational terms. It's very difficult to actually listen to somebody properly if you are fuming completely underneath, no matter how calm you might look on top. So be quick to hear, be slow to speak, be slow to anger. So there are various things we can ask ourselves this morning, and I'm very aware that whenever I speak, I do ask an awful lot of questions that I don't answer. So, am I angry? When I become angry, am I angry at what has happened? Or am I angry at the person? When I'm angry at a person, it depersonalizes them. It devalues that person. It tries to make us feel superior. If they thought like me, if they did things my way, because obviously I'm so much better a driver than anybody else. Plenty of you have been with me in the car. The thing is, it actually makes us less when we do that. When we treat other people like that, it actually takes us away from being the person that God has created us to be. It makes us less like Jesus. Jesus doesn't depersonalize. He doesn't devalue people. When we have anger at a person, it fractures relationships. There becomes that heat in that situation. It leads to hatred, but it's aimed at a person. That's harmful in so many different ways. And it can lead to murder in our hearts, even if not in reality. Now, I'm not saying that their actions may not be the cause of some kind of injustice or evil. But God and Jesus actually asks us to love them, even if we hate what they're doing. And in 3 weeks' time, that's the other light and fluffy topic I've got. But when I'm getting angry at a person, do I think of people as fools? Now, we use the word fool quite lightly in some ways these days, and in some ways almost as a joke. But actually, when I've been reading some commentaries and bits, when it says, do you call someone raka, that's more like the idiot, fool. When it says fool, that was more like using some heavy expletive-laden, really unpleasant, directed thing. Much more aggressive than we tend to use the word fool for. So it's not necessarily a translation that says, how that would have been thought of at the time. It's a total contempt for a person. And we don't always say it out loud, but what's going on in our heads? Do I treat people like they're fools? Because if I do, I'm not going to value them as human. And I'm probably not going to listen to them either. People's behaviour comes out of what's going on underneath. Am I listening to that, or am I just judging them? When I've got anger at a situation or behaviour, there are times when that is justified. It's harming people. But even then, we're called to love the person. We are still called to love people, even if they're harming other people. Even if we hate their actions. If they're harming people, they aren't free. Famously, Martin Luther King said, "Don't come on the marches if you actually don't want the best for the person that is persecuting you." Because actually, those that are causing that injustice, those that are causing that harm, they are not free either. And no matter what it is that's causing that kind of anger, it's not our place to get angry at the people. Yes, we want to see things change. Yes, we want to see justice. Yes, we want to see healing. But let's treat people as God's beloved children, whether they know that or not. Now, one of my things that I've been looking at for quite some time is about reconciliation, and looking at actually God really seeks reconciliation between God and humans, between humans and humans, between each of us, between us and the world, between God and the world. And the examples that Jesus gives here in verses 23 to 26 are very relational. If you're offering your gift at the altar and there remember your brother or sister has something against you, leave that gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to them, and then come and offer your gift. Settle matters quickly with your adversary. So Jesus always wants us to try for reconciliation. He wants us to come and be reconciled to other people, to be back in relationship with them. The thing is, we actually don't have full control over that. I can turn around and say, I would love to be reconciled to somebody. But unless they want that too, that can't happen. I can do my part. I have to leave their part to them. It has to be two-way, and it's not always possible, but it should always be our aim. And one thing that kind of made me wonder slightly, when Jesus talks about leaving your gift at the altar, this was their way of worship. Now, there's a whole load of practical things in terms of that. If you're leaving your sheep at the altar and going off 60 miles to go and be reconciled to someone, all kinds of weird and wonderful stuff. But actually, is Jesus saying that this is more important than worship? And I think it's very, very hard to worship God who we can't see when we are hating or are angry at our brother that we can. That is slightly paraphrasing 1 John 4, which says, whoever claims to love God yet hates a brother or sister is a liar. For whoever does not love their brother and sister whom they have seen cannot love God whom they have not seen. But I think it's so true. We can't really worship in spirit and truth when we really are holding anger against somebody else. So is it more important than worship? No. But I do think that it is something that allows us to worship fully. And Jesus tells them to sort it out first, if possible. And I know, like I said, the hyperbole thing means that it could almost look like, well, you must never come and worship if you've not sorted that out. That's not what Jesus is saying. It's the heart attitude. Am I seeking to see reconciliation? Am I wanting to get rid of that anger from my heart towards that person? it may not be possible. The person may have died. It might actually not be safe to be in relationship with them. And it has to be two-way. If they don't want it, you can't be reconciled. But you can have a heart for it. And that's a very different heart from a heart that's holding anger. A heart that's holding that resentment. So when I am looking at putting together something like this, I'm always thinking, okay, so what? So what's the practical bit on this? And I think there's a few bits here that God really looks at the heart. There's a fantastic book written by a guy called Dallas Willard, which does riff round on the Sermon on the Mount quite a lot, called The Divine Conspiracy. And in that he says, to succeed in keeping the law, one must aim to become the kind of person from whom the deeds of the law naturally flow. The apple tree naturally and easily produces apples because of its inner nature. It's an apple tree, it produces apples. I'm a loving, reconciling type person. I'm not going to be doing murder. It's not about focusing on our actions, it's about focusing on our heart attitudes. And so much of what Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount is about our heart attitudes. But I get the feeling, like I said, that people then kind of still try to codify that and put that into a list of rules. So James comes along and puts it a bit more bluntly. It's about what's going on inside. So, am I angry at people, or am I angry at the things they've done? Because if I'm angry at people, that's going to fracture relationship. It's going to distort our judgment. Am I holding on to anger? We've got a few more points there, haven't we? Keep going. Thank you. Am I holding on to it overnight? Am I coming back to it time and time again? Is it something that I like to, I'll remember that one. The thing is, that just acts like a poison. Doctors will tell you it raises your blood pressure. It harms us, and it can lead to worse. It can lead to murder. It certainly fractures those relationships. Am I the kind of person who aims for reconciliation with people, or someone who holds on to separation and anger? Last week, Esther said, being light is part of the God family business, and we're part of that family. I'm going to edit that and say, being a reconciler is also part of God's family business, and we're part of that family. This is what it means to be part of what Jesus is like. So do I allow God's words to really change how I think as well as how I act? So there's an awful lot of stuff going on in there. And like I said, as per usual, I've thrown out a lot of questions. And as the worship team comes this morning, if there are things that you would like just to respond, sometimes actually getting out of a seat and saying, I'm going to respond. I'm going to say to God, yes, I know that's something that's going on in my heart. I know that actually I've got fractured relationships. I know that I've got people that I am literally holding something against them. And that anger, that resentment, whatever word you want to use for it, because it sounds better if it's resentment than anger, doesn't it? Then that's lurking underneath. If you want to just say that to God, then just come and sit at the front. If you want someone to come and pray with you, someone will come and pray with you. But if not, that's fine. Equally, if you just want to come and pray because actually it's something that you just want to pray about this morning, then also come to the front. Nobody's going to force themselves to pray with anybody. But if you would like someone to pray with you, then that's fine. But I'm going to encourage people to come just and sit at the front or stand at the front or whatever, just as a response to say, actually, yes, I am taking a stand on this because I know that's what's been going on in my heart and in my mind.